Bonsoir, bon après-midi. Bienvenue à la deuxième événement de cette année pour l'école McGill de politique publique. Je m'appelle Chris Reagan et par nuit, je suis économiste, mais par jour, je suis directeur de l'école. And I'd like to welcome you to a responsible journalism in an age of hyper-polarization, an event that the McGill School of Public Policy is putting on jointly with Media at McGill, which has received generous funding from Beaverbrook Canadian Foundation. So thank you very much to both Media at McGill and the Beaverbrook. Before we get to the main event, I would like to give you some shameless advertising for the McGill School of Public Policy. Public outreach is an important part of our mandate, to have events like this where we can be talking about important issues of public policy. After tonight, our next event is November 20th. November 20th, in this room, we will be hosting the Senior Deputy Governor from the Bank of Canada, Carolyn Wilkins, to talk about the complexity of monetary policy. On November 27th in Toronto, if you just happen to be in Toronto, we will be having an event that's sort of a sister event to this one, where we'll be talking about what media can be trusted and what media you should be trusting in this age of hyperpolarization. And February 5th, we have also in this room, we have a big panel discussion about populism. Populism in the United States, populism in Canada, what it means, where it comes from, why we care, and what we can do about it, if anything. The other thing I'd like to talk about is what has been keeping most of us at the McGill School very busy for the last year, which is a development of a new Master of Public Policy program, an MPP program. When you came in, you might have seen these brochures. I encourage you to take one, possibly two. You can send them to friends, send them to your children who possibly are still living at home and you'd like to get rid of them. Or if you've got anybody in your life that you think needs to study public policy, send them to us and we will take care of them. That program has been designed over the past year. The website is completely live now. If you Google McGill MPP, it'll take you straight to the details of the MPP program. And that application process is now open for students to arrive in our first cohort in September of 2019. So that is the end of the shameless advertising. Now to the main event for tonight. And I'm going to read you a paragraph that is a very nicely written paragraph, not by me, about what tonight's event is all about. Across the English-speaking developed countries, the broad story told about journalism is much the same. As the consumption of traditional journalism sources continues to decline, those who do consume news increasingly gravitate toward partisan sources. These communities of news consumers turn into echo chambers, where citizens hear only the views that they themselves already hold. One consequence is that the traditional broad-based media seems increasingly alien and out of touch. And so people lose their trust in mainstream media and instead seek out only those media sources that reflect their increasingly polarized opinions. The broad strokes of this narrative are well documented in the United States, but does this general narrative apply in Canada? That is one of the questions for tonight's panel. Those words were written by Andrew Potter and company in an article that just was posted today live on Policy Options webpage, which means it was also edited very professionally by Jennifer Ditchburn. So, without further ado, let me introduce Andrew Potter. Andrew Potter is a former journalist and a man who has become a good friend of mine over the past few months. And I look forward to many years more of that. He's also a professor in the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, teaching Can studies to all those people who want to learn about Canadian studies. So Andrew Potter, please come on up here and you can tell us something about this article that you and your compatriots wrote and the data behind it, and then you can introduce your panelists. Thank you very much.
Merci, Chris. Bonsoir tout le monde. Thanks, Chris. So yeah, just to follow up on that, that might be one of the few paragraphs written by a committee of 4 and edited by 1 that actually reads like it may not have been written by a committee, but that's Jennifer's work almost entirely. So, so to follow up on that, with Chris Reagan's encouragement, when we conceived of this panel and the one that we're doing in Toronto in a month and next month at the end of November, we thought to sort of juice interest in it, and it's always useful, especially when you're talking to journalists or trying to get journalists' attention, it's useful to have fresh meat to throw at them. And we thought some kind of survey talking about journalists is something that journalists are always interested in. And so we commissioned a survey to sort of look at attitudes towards journalism, what people's consumption habits are, their political preferences, their beliefs about the world, and their trust in news organizations, and then ask them questions about what, if anything, they think the government should be doing about supporting the Canadian media. So we sort of, a real grab bag of issues were thrown into it. And essentially what we're trying to get at is this intersection of partisanship, news consumption, and trust that seems to be in the air right now. And as Chris sort of in that little paragraph he read, unlike the United States, where this narrative of what they're calling truth decay, which is a nice little term that I only realized today at the dentist with my son, that it's a riff on tooth decay, right? But truth decay is, like the US where that is somewhat entrenched, with this idea of partisan media silos and distrust of mainstream media and everyone in their own little wallowing in their alternative facts. The Canadian story is actually a bit different, and that's what came out of the survey we did. And there were a few main results that are interesting, and 2 key differences between Canada and the United States. One of which is that despite the fact that Canadians do have different political views, we are divided over politics, and we do consume different media depending on our political leanings. People either consume the National Post or the Toronto Star or what have you, depending on where they lean, that we continue to live in a common world of facts. That is, there is not a great deal of divergence over facts. This idea of alternative facts is not set in. Canadians generally have a common worldview about the facts about the world. A second is they have very high levels of trust in mainstream media. And that is the big media outlets that govern our lives. CBC and Radio-Canada, and La Presse here, and the Globe and Mail, the CBC, and the Toronto Star in Toronto. The trust is very high, which is a good thing. And there remains a number of policy conundrums come out of this, but one of which is that despite this very high level of trust in media, Canadians really don't support federal intervention, federal support for the media. That is 22% of English-speaking Canadians and 23% of French-speaking Quebecers support giving money to the failing media. So there's an interesting conundrum here. The media we say we trust the most, we actually are very reluctant to support. And that's one of the issues that we're going to be talking about. It may come up tonight, where there's one of the things I want to get at tonight is about trust. But I also want to get at some other serious issues put on the table first. So why don't I get the panel up here, and why don't you guys come on up, and then I'll introduce you quickly. So on the far left is Philippe Goyer, who's the editor-in-chief of Vice Quebec. Before that, he was an editor at Actualité. He's had a whole bunch of other jobs in journalism. To his right is Jennifer Ditchburn. She's currently the editor of Policy Options, which is the digital magazine of the Institute for Research and Public Policy. Before coming to Policy Options, she spent 2 decades or so covering national and parliamentary affairs for the Canadian Press and for CBC. And to my left is Mark Lloyd, who is currently a professor of professional practice at the McGill School of Public Policy here at McGill. He's also a clinical professor at the University of Southern California, Annenberg, in the School of Communication there. But he also spent 15 years as a working journalist, working for CNN and NBC, so he has great experience and a lot of perspective on a lot of these issues we're going to raise. So let's have a hand for the panel, please. So I think we'll do away with opening statements, opening remarks, or anything like that. I think what we'll do is I want to touch on three main themes over the next 45 minutes or so, then we'll open up to questions. The main themes, I think, are first, the question of how you cover fringe groups, fringe political groups, the challenges of that. One of the things that was a big deal in Toronto recently was how to cover someone like Faith Goldie, who had somewhat notorious views on things, whether giving her attention was involved giving her a platform. That's one issue. Second is the question of what has been called both-sidism, or he said, she said journalism, or stenography, where journalists are engaging in too much balance at the expense of truth, or the expense of giving, or at the cost of giving oxygen again to climate change deniers, or what have you. And the third is, again, just this question of trust. How much it should be a value of journalism, how much what its scope and its limits are. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with Philippe and say one of the things that Vice Quebec is specialized in is covering radical politics, fringe politics here in Quebec, which has certain challenges both ethically but also I think practically. Do you want to sort of speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the visit that we got by a group called Atalante, who are Quebec City based. Kind of offshoot of a Quebec City-based skinhead group called the Quebec Stompers. Atalante came to our offices last May and sort of came in showed up with a bouquet of flowers at the door, and so our receptionist let him in, and then a bunch of people stormed into the office and started throwing papers around and yelling at us, and they were gone within about 10 or 15 minutes or so. And so that was that was our kind of like the most tangible consequence we've had to covering the far right was suddenly having these people in our office. But what had led to that was an article we'd printed about a week and a half before that, where we'd been told by several far right and far left groups that some very sort of specific confrontations were planned in Rosemont and in a few other parts of the city, where Antifa demonstrators were going to show up to far right activists or far right thinkers' houses and whatever, spray paint them and basically cause some ruckus. And so we'd run this piece about how basically this kind of antagonism that was mostly happening on the web and mostly happening in chat rooms sort of separate from each other was kind of descending into the streets now, and that this was going to start to be an issue for Montrealers in terms of public security, but also for Canadians and Quebecers as a matter of kind of a toxification of the political debate. Evidently, this did not please Atalante, with whom we'd had sort of sporadic contact leading into that piece, and they decided to sort of take it in their own hands. Now, the issue that we have now is basically how that is what we do from here, because we're bound in some way by an ongoing police investigation. There are criminal charges laid against Raph Stomber, or Raphael Lévesque, his real name. And he's been charged with mischief and breaking and entering and a bunch of other things. And he's looking at quite a serious jail sentence if he's convicted on any of these things, because he's got a long rap sheet, and also because the provision for intimidating journalists in the criminal code, I believe, includes up to 10 years in prison. So it's quite a serious case in that one. And so we've had constant debates in the newsroom about how exactly we cover this without becoming players, either in the criminal trial or rather in exacerbating the tension that already exists with the far right that we have. So we basically tackle it. We kind of have some ground rules that we use to define how we get into any sort of coverage of the far right. I mean, the first is it's all based on the assumption or on the premise that any coverage that we give will amplify their views. It's in the nature of what we do. it's very much, it's in fact the purpose of what we do is to amplify both views and information that we believe to be in the public interest. So anything that we do will amplify those views, and we can't control how people are going to react to the information or to the opinions or analysis that people get from what we do. We can't control that 100%. I mean, we can do our best, but we're not ultimately able to constrain those reactions. So the three things that we look at when we're going to cover far right stories now, and even leading up to that, but it's a reflection that we've had a lot more after the Atalante thing was, I mean, if the first is that a group or an individual's ideas in the far right has to have transcended the community from which those ideas where they gestated, basically. So as soon as those ideas start to seep into whether it's mainstream political debates or other forms of activism, that will take an interest. The next one is that we have to be comfortable that we understand the context in which that radicalization happened. So whether it's online communities, whether it's other groups that are radicalizing specific people, whether groups are offshoots, specifically radical offshoots of broader fringe right groups. We have to understand the kind of genealogy of where these things are going for us to be able to report on them coherently and intelligently. And the third thing is that the reader has to be able to quickly and kind of clearly understand the ties that bind that group or that individual's views to a larger political debate. So whether that's, you know, what was painted as the kind of refugee crisis over the summer, or if we had like a radical populist be elected to government, so there has to that tie-in has to be clear to the reader so that the reader understands why we're doing this and where it's manifesting itself. So I mean that's the kind of basic framework for where we're at in terms of covering these fringe groups.
Mark or Jennifer, do you have anything you want to ask Philip or?
Well, just something that comes to mind is that we had the same kind of struggles, I guess, in the 1980s and the 1990s with how to cover Holocaust deniers. And back then it was basically an accepted wisdom that you did not cover Holocaust deniers unless they were going to jail or they were being convicted or they were being deported. I'm thinking of someone like Ernst Sundell. Ernst Sundell would try to come on Parliament Hill occasionally to give a press conference, and there would go around that we're not going to cover him, and we're going to pretend like it didn't happen. But I think, Philippe, what you're talking about is when do you need to cover a group when they start to not just be, as you said, confined into a small group of people that don't have widespread or their views aren't spreading. And I think that the change between the 90s and the 2000s or the early 2000s and now is social media and the tools that people can use to have their views spread. I think you're dealing with a completely different context than we were 20 years ago when we could all just collectively decide that no one will hear about this person. Well, there's going to be, you know, somebody from a fringe media group that's going to video them, post it online, and it will spread that way through whichever platforms that they choose to use. So I think there's that level of complication that's happened in journalism over the past number of years. Anyway.
I mean, I don't know what, I mean, I can tell you, I worked at CNN for 4 or 5 years. I worked in Washington and covered, you know, probably every major beat in Washington there was to cover. CNN was a very different operation than it is now. And the fact of the matter is there was, and I think still is, so much news that's really worth reporting. And you have to make a decision about whether or not a small group, fringe group, however they're marginalized, is really worth the time when there are other things that are much more important that need to be explained and that people are interested in. So there really wasn't much of a, frankly, much of a debate in the newsrooms, at least at CNN, about covering fringe groups in the 80s. There was still a lot of news. It's like drinking from a fire hose. I think Jennifer raises a good point about social media and the fact that an awful lot will come up whether you want to cover it or not, or whether you think it's important or not, and so you feel as if you are somehow forced to cover some of these issues. But again, CNN is a very different place than the place that I worked at when I was there. It's not the same product at all. It's much more like MSNBC in terms of format and Fox in terms of format. One of the challenges that I have, having studied the history of journalism, is that fake news, the fact that originally marginalized communities can take over, that really minorities can actually have a dominant view. Frankly, I don't think most Americans at the time were really concerned about communist subversives working in the U.S. During the McCarthy period, but it became a major issue because there was a senator very interested in that and was actually able to push it. And so one of the other challenges, in addition to social media, is that you've got people who are very prominent, most notably the President of the United States, who is able to actually bring up some of the views of marginalized and fringe groups. And it's sort of hard to say, we're not going to cover this when you've got the president tweeting what they're putting up on their website. It's an unusual situation in the United States. I don't think we've ever had anyone quite like this before. To some extent, the business of media is responsible for the reality TV star. But in terms of whether or not these groups should be covered, again, I think the degree to which we can use the 24-hour news cycle and cover as much as possible, but do it responsibly, I think we ought to do it. Yeah.
I think Jennifer raised a really important point about understanding that online media ecosystem, and I mean we see it tangibly too. If we, last year, I think around spring last year, New York Times ran quite an extensive profile of a guy named Tony Hovater, who's like this neo-Nazi in Ohio who is very active on 4chan and Gab and all these online forums and Daily Stormer and these things, and the piece was really poorly received, and it was a poorly executed piece, and it was deservedly poorly received. And the sort of hole at the heart of that story was how little credence the journalist had given to the online radicalization, and exactly how much Hovater had been radicalized on 4chan and on in these specific online forums. And right around the same time, The Atlantic ran a really big cover story on Andrew Anglin, who is the guy behind the Daily Stormer, the sort of big American neo-Nazi site. And that was kind of the polar opposite, where, the richness of the Atlantic piece was precisely in how deeply it went into those online links. I think there's sometimes a failure in our line of work to take internet communities or online communities seriously. We still have this strange kind of snobism of treating people who write online as if they're like, that really lame dad joke about like the dude and the blogger in the mom's basement that people always make in terms of when they reference people who are contributing online. But this is the probably the principal platform for radicalization, whether that's alt-right or jihadism or anything else. And those two examples that were published so shortly, one after the other, really illustrate the stark difference between a news story that treats online radicalization seriously and one that kind of misses that point.
Yeah, if I could just ask you a follow-up question on this. So I'm on a few private sort of Slack channels where journalists sort of gather to talk about stuff. And there's this, during the recent elections, municipal elections in Toronto, a lot of them are they're Toronto-based. They're very wound up about Faith Goldie, right, who's got questionable views and questionable contacts and so on. And while on the one hand, the collective wisdom of this channel was, and they were adamant almost universally that she should not be covered, right? And because she had some ads she tried to run on Bell, I think, and they were turned down. And it's not clear why they were declined and so on. And they were like, good, she should be given no platform. And yet these journalists were obsessed with her, right? Like if the conversation on this channel is any indication, these journalists are obsessed with Faith Goldie and her, the minutiae of her life and so on. Is there a disconnect between what we think the audience should and should not get, and is that dangerous between what journalists are actually thinking about and talking about? Because that was Gawker's original view. Was what's interesting is how journalists talk about journalism, right? Not how we write about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I was going to bring up specifically the Gawker example, which we saw. I mean, was good in a lot of ways, in that Gawker was kind of revolutionary in terms of like the way it covered the actual internet as a thing that was a breeding ground for ideas and actions and communities. Now, I think the debate around Faith Goldie, to me, is whether you can actually starve Faith Goldie of oxygen in the public space, whether it's possible. I think that's really what it comes down to. I think for the most part, the consensus idea that it's good to not give Faith Goldie oxygen is the correct idea. It hinges on whether it's possible to do so by ignoring her from Toronto Star editorial board meetings and Globe and Mail panels. In the specific case of Faith Goldie, I do think it's possible.
But is this not, and this is a question maybe for Mark and Jennifer, is this not a very strong retreat from journalists' self-image as the idea that sunlight is a disinfectant, right? That we've almost seemed to have retreated from that. The idea that the journalism can no longer play that role. At best, it might simply amplify, but it might actually amplify in a dangerous way.
Well, I mean, sorry, oh no.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking of it in like if we look at the way, say, cybersecurity is covered, right? Where if a major flaw is discovered in software that's installed on 50 or 60% of servers worldwide, a cybersecurity researcher is not going to write a story about it until that flaw is patched. Like the idea is to not give people weapons to do harm against society, and I do think in cases where we end up with harmful ideas like Faith Goldie's white nationalism, I don't think sunlight is enough. The same way, sort of signaling through the press to a software company that its servers are full of holes and can be hacked within 30 seconds is not necessarily, and you're not necessarily doing public good.
No, in the end, she did get 3.8% of the vote in Toronto, which is not insignificant. So I have a hard time with this question because, in a proportional representation scenario, for example, in Canada, you might have people who are elected to government. I doubt it, but you could have people who are elected who have extreme views. And so what are you going to do at that point? Say that you're not going to cover these representatives because you don't agree with them? I think it's a really fine line, and I'm not going to land on either one with Faith Goldie, but I do think it's tricky when journalists sort of appoint themselves as the arbiters of who's worth covering and who's not. And each case that gets decided in each newsroom in a different way, with a certain amount of looking around to see what the other guy's doing or the other woman to say, okay, if they're doing it, then I can. There's obviously a certain amount of packed journalism that goes on. But I don't think we can have, in any story or any issue, a kind of rule that applies because it's just always moving. And there's so many problems with journalism that I'm sure we'll get to that intersect with these questions.
Well, I mean, the whole question of whether or not someone ought to be covered, this is a major issue with regard to whether the press ought to report on President Trump's tweets.
Right. Yeah.
And if you're not reporting on what the president is saying, or without regard to whether it's the truth or whether it's a lie, whether it exaggerates some other right-wing website or what someone else says, then you're really not doing your job. Part of the challenge that CNN and that other operations face is to what extent are you actually able to sort of pierce the veil of respectability, let's say, and actually present something that's true, that puts it in context. And how do you find a way to do that? We had the same problem with regard to President Reagan, who would sometimes just say things, particularly in his later years, and you simply would not want to put it on the air because he clearly didn't know what he was talking about. And so you would find some way to report the story, or you just wouldn't report it. But part of the job of the journalist, really, I think, which is, and journalism is hard. It's not as easy as it seems. It is almost inherently incomplete, on the run, imperfect, that it is called the first draft of history for a very good reason. It is just a first draft. It is really not trustworthy unless you're able to look at other sites and determine what's reported is actually the news. It's one of the things that journalists do on a regular basis. You read what other journalists are writing and you go and you double check, is that right? It's one of the reasons you teach young journalists from the start, you don't just rip something up, which used to be called The Wire, and read it, because you don't know if AP or Reuters or whoever it was actually reporting the truth. You have to follow up and find out whether that's right. So one of the challenges becomes, whether it's the president, whether it's Goldie, whoever it is what's being said true? Can you put it in the context so that your audience actually understands it and gains something from it? Does it actually advance the discussion, or is it simply sensational? So one of the things that I teach at USC is both media law and ethics. And part of the challenge that a number of young journalists face is, well, they think that they're sort of off the hook if they just report what someone said, and they are not.
Okay, so let's get that's an excellent segue into the next question, or the next topic I want to talk about is, so after Trump was elected, apart from the general trauma that fell across Western civilization, there was also a specific trauma that journalists felt, because there was this a widespread view amongst journalists themselves, but also commentators and academics and so on, that journalism had specifically failed in its duties. And the line that sort of emerged came out of guys like Jay Rosen, Jeff Jarvis, and a few other sort of the deans of American sort of digital journalism, was that they had engaged in excessive both-siderism. Or he said, she said journalism, or Jay Rosen calls it the view from nowhere. The idea that a commitment to balance cost Hillary Clinton the election. That is, because they would treat Hillary's emails as equivalent to Trump not releasing his tax forms and so on. And Jay Rosen's view on this is that journalists need to abandon this idea they need to be balanced and should embrace their biases, be transparent about them, but embrace them. And that doesn't strike me as a great idea, but I wonder, Jennifer, you were sort of on the Parliament Hill for 10 years. 20, pardon me, sorry. I'm sure at various times you were accused of being in the tank for one side or the other by various people. To what extent was balance one of the overriding concerns you had, versus telling the truth about one side? You certainly didn't, you're not going to go interview a flat earther after someone says the Earth's round and so on, right? But so to what extent was balance one of the overriding virtues or motivations for what you're trying to do?
Well, it's definitely one of the, the pillars that people believe inside of journalism, right? That balance and fairness and definitely. It's interesting if you could hear conversations inside newsrooms during elections, and I'm thinking specifically about the CBC, and they actually will count the number of stories that are done about one person or another. to make sure that they're not over-reporting one side. And Ryan, I see you sitting over there, but you could you'll probably agree with me. Ryan Hassman used to work for the CBC. So I think that there's, inherently a problem there, because you're suggesting that, there's a certain number of negative stories that you can write about one side and a certain that you can write about another side. Well, life doesn't work that way. The other problem that I have with, I really like Jay Rosen, and I think he's really one of the people in America who's talking about journalism in a really deep way. But this whole idea of being transparent about your biases, I don't think most journalists even understand what the structural biases are in journalism. For example, I'll give you an example of something that's covered in Canada quite widely, which I have a big beef with, which is the way that the Trans Mountain Pipeline is covered, just as an example. So for a long time this year, the balance of the Trans Mountain Pipeline story was that the BC government was going up, and the environmentalists are going up against Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau. This is the balanced story that was being presented. It was basically, this is all you would read in every Canadian newspaper. None of those stories would ever address one of the core issues of that Trans Mountain Pipeline story, which was Indigenous communities, nations, and their rights under Section 35 of the Constitution, which, as we know, the Federal Court of Appeal ruling was the whole thing that Trans Mountain is breaking on is that one issue. But Canadian journalists, I don't think, have done a big reflection on colonialism in journalism, on the overarching views about the economy, what we accept as a truism. I mean, I don't want to sound too much like a raging lefty, but if you think about how, when you open the newspaper in any newspaper in Canada, and you read about a particular story, there are some assumptions about how society should proceed, right? And so when Jay talks about declaring your biases, I think politicians think of the biases being about liberal, conservative, or, in the States, Republican or Democratic, but the biases run way deeper than that. And not to mention the fact that newsrooms are overwhelmingly white, the coverage is overwhelmingly white. So if we want to talk about declaring biases, this is going to take a long time. So I would say that this, part of the solution, I'll go back to Walter Lippmann, who was a communications commentator from the 1920s, I guess, in America. Who was then advocating for journalists to have a more scientific method, or to go into deeper verification skills. And I think actually that's something that resonates with me. So to train journalists better to seeking out the truth, how to read data, how to look at statistics and know when the statistics are faulty. And we're so rushed all the time that when we're grabbing the sensational story about a tweet or what have you, that I think those skills are breaking down. There's no silver bullet to what ails journalism, but I think that's a good start. Yeah.
Mark, this you were nodding while Jennifer was talking about the sort of the deeper biases than left, right. Is this a new debate in journalism?
No. I mean, So Lippmann writing in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, to a great extent, really sort of helped define a professional practice of journalism. Prior to that period of time, journalism was whatever anybody who had the ability to put together some lead letters on and press them. That's what journalism was. I mean, there really was no profession. I've met Jay, and I've read a lot of his work, and a great deal of respect, and certainly wouldn't debate him without him being here on the panel. But the notion that somehow journalists should declare their biases, and I think Jennifer is absolutely right, they're usually not even aware of the deeper set of biases that they might hold. That doesn't make a great deal of sense. Part of what it was that I think Lippmann finally, toward the end of his writing, suggested is that journalism should be objective. It is an aspiration, but it is difficult because we all have biases. We have biases that we're not aware of, but the fact of the matter is, if we are close to a subject, we should not be reporting on that subject. I mean, if we really feel that this is really the most important thing, not only should we not declare it, but we should make sure that our editors or our producers or whoever is responsible for us, they know that we really feel deeply about whatever it is, the state of Israel or the condition of Martin Luther King or whatever it is, or McGill, right? So how do you report on things that you are deeply involved in? And of course, those things must be admitted. But if you are a producer or an editor, you'd be very careful about making sure this person isn't the only voice on the paper or the program or whatever with regard to a particular story. Objectivity is an important and useful modern goal. Readers, listeners should never assume that what they are getting is perfectly objective. And the only way to do that is to make sure that we've got a smart audience and people who understand that, while you do have journalists who do try their best, who work hard at trying to be objective, they always require a check. And the check is other media and all of the people that consume the journalism.
So I'm going to throw something at Philippe, because I think Jay Rosen might say, look, you guys are overthinking this. It's not about deep biases and the unacknowledged biases towards neoliberalism, what have you, that he's concerned about. It's when somebody says something that is manifestly false, you simply should not just report what they said. You should say, that's right, he lied, right? Which is what everyone wants. Literally, the New York Times publishes a story, and everyone says, look, New York Times, I fixed your headline for you, right? And it says, instead of Trump said, it says Trump lied, for instance, right? So to put it into the context you might be dealing with, Philippe, so if someone like Meurthe, for instance, says to you, one of your reporters, there is a flood of immigrants streaming across the border, right? Thousands a day or something like that. How do you handle that? Are we obliged to point out, fact check in the context of it, or you know what I'm getting at, sort of?
Yeah, we don't. As a rule, we don't allow anyone to use our platform to advance any kind of untruth or anything that's false, any idea that's false. So we fact check everything we do. Or we fact check everything people say, and if what they say either is false or is misleading in any way, we do our best to kind of clear it up for the reader. But I do think that the Trump context and poses a really special challenge in this case because the point of saying falsehoods. Trump's point in saying falsehoods is to have them debunked by the media and then point to his allies and say, or point to the media and tell his allies, these are our enemies. Everything they say about us is negative, and all the coverage that we get is critical, and nobody likes us, and this is part of the deep state and the swamp that we need to drain, and the sort of globalist consensus that drives modern world affairs. Right, and so you're stuck in this almost impossible limbo where I'm not sure what the answer, what the solution to that is. Steve Bannon gave an interview in the New York Times right after Trump's election, where he said the Democratic Party is not the opposition. The opposition is the press. You, the New York Times, are the opposition. We don't really care. We had a sort of lesser version. I think, you would certainly be able to speak to this. But when Stephen Harper was first elected, he decided the people who are most, probably fun and it's for whom it's most advantageous to beat up on is the press, right? The first thing he did was kind of pick a fight with the press gallery. It seemed, and this is to a much. I'm not drawing a direct comparison between the two, but clearly Stephen Harper decided that there are more points to be gained by making the press your enemy, then you know, the Liberals or the NDP or the Bloc Québécois at that time. And I think Steve Bannon and Donald Trump have pushed that. I mean, to, you know, to the further than Stephen Harper possibly could have imagined it. But it does pose a huge problem, because what do you do when somebody lies to your face, you correct it, and then somebody says, "See, I knew you hated me," right?
Yeah, that's
Well,
what
and I would just respond to that is that, and I think that Mark alluded to it, one thing that drove me crazy during the Harper years was the obsession with going to like every photo op, right? So like you would spend your limited resources, journalistic resources, on like every fart, right? Like I'm going to go and cover this because it's the prime minister. And I think we're seeing this times 1 million in the United States, like every tweet, every press conference, everything. And I think there is, we as journalists, journalism outlets, we have choice. I mean, we don't have to. This is what used to drive me crazy on the Hill. I was like, we don't have to go to that photo op. He doesn't want any journalists there. We don't have to go. We can do something else, and we can spend our time and our money, which is in short supply, covering something deep and profound. So instead of covering Trump's tweets on the caravan, like go to the caravan, talk to the people that are suffering as they try to get to the border. You're nodding.
Well, no, only that one of the challenges, I mean, this is. We have had presidents before go after the press. Harry Truman went after the press very successfully. And he considered the press, you know, right-wing and in the pocket of the industrialist. Richard Nixon famously went after the press, the nattering nabobs of negativism from Richard Nixon, and was just outraged and thought he could outlast the Watergate investigation. Ronald Reagan was just exceptionally smart with the press, because he knew that as long as he had a great backdrop and things looked wonderful and people weren't paying very much attention to what he was saying, everything was just fine. But they figured out a way to use the press, which is maybe a little bit worse than Trump. I don't remember, and I can't think that I've ever read of at least a president of the United States calling the press the enemy of the people. Mm-hmm. This is, if there's ever been a time when we needed an independent, objective, and robust press, it is now. As inarticulate, as partial, as incomplete, as inaccurate, as all the things that the press might be, even the best press, we need the press now, at least in the United States, more than ever, to try to keep track of what's wrong, to count the number of lies, to call them lies, and to be upfront and honest about it. And this is also a time when it is dangerous to be a member of the press. Not dangerous because the state is going to attack you, but because some of the people, the crazy people on either the right or the left, they will come after you, as we just saw with the bombs sent to CNN. This is a dangerous time to work and oppose a president who is really viewed with a scary sort of adulation. If you ever want to be just sort of frightened for the press, you should go to one of the Trump rallies and see the press sort of pinned in and yelled at and being encouraged by the press and by the president to go after these people who were back there, because they are the enemy. This is a scary, scary time. And so you have to cover it. But the challenge becomes is that somehow the things that are happening at the EPA sort of end up not quite as front page as they should be. The things that are happening with the Treasury Department are not quite up there as front as they should be, particularly with regard to the consumer financial affairs. It's like you don't know really what's happening because you end up covering things that are really not quite as important as the things that will affect the lives of everyday people. But if I have a challenge, particularly with CNN, again, it's a very different product, is that you have all this time to do this work. You've got time to cover these other things. And you should find a way to get that on the air. With the internet, heavens, you've got to be able to figure out how to get some of this information that's really affecting people up in front of them in a way that you can. And frankly, they are not doing that. They're sitting around talking to panels and talking to themselves about how beat up they are. And again, that's very serious, it's very important, but there are other things going on that are affecting the public.
And every outlet's different, right?
Yeah.
I think in the U.S. now, there's incredible journalism happening.
That's right.
And I think we saw a kind of phenomenon here, which I wrote about in a book that we published a few years ago on Harper and his policy legacy. And within the media, there was a kind of rupture in the relationship between the media and government when the Conservatives came to power in 2006, and it's happened with Trump. And that is that we have certain expectations for how the other side is going to behave. So when you have someone who comes to office and says, well, yeah, we're just not going to talk to you anymore, ministers aren't going to give you interviews, public servants won't give you technical or statistical information, not unless you have 3 weeks for it. So all of a sudden, the media is like, wait a second, like, this is not how we've operated. It does not compute. The same thing happened with the press corps in Washington. But what happens, and I tried to document this, is that journalists usually, anyway, if you say I'm not giving you any information, they won't just go and sit at their desk and think, well, I guess I should take the day off. No, actually, they're going to commit resources to investigative work. And I think that we saw that in the way that Canadian media outlets could, there was some really interesting work that was done because there was no access. I mean, if you don't have any access, what are you going to do? Well, you got to talk to other people. You have to. The rise in access to information requests over a certain period in the conservative years was 210% among media outlets. And there's a reason for that, because you couldn't get information any other way. That's like a small silver lining that I see. That the problem in Canada and also the US is that there's just fewer journalists. Yeah. And that's a big problem in all of this.
The last thing I want to talk about before we open up to questions from the audience is, it's obviously related to all this, which is the question of trust. And one of the interesting things that came out of our survey was the extent to which Canadians actually still do trust their large media outlets. The startups, Huffington Post and BuzzFeed and Vice and so on, less so. And a similar pattern holds for the United States as well. There seems to be quite high trust in New York Times, Washington Post, and so on right now, less so in the startups. But journalists have, the journalism sort of community, and especially the academic journalists, have come to this idea that trust is now the be-all and end-all of what they need to be doing. And there are, it's become a running joke, which is how many different trust projects there are. I think the Neiman Lab counted up, there's like 5, and it was like, you guide to your trust projects, right? Who's running it and what the terms are and so on. But one of the downsides, this is a point that was pointed out by Emily Bell of the Tao Center, is that, amongst Fox viewers, Fox is very trusted, right? Fox has a very high trust. And there's emerging data which suggests that the most polarized groups in our society are not the youth, the kids, Generation Z and millennials who are on Instagram and Twitter all day. It's actually seniors, because all they're doing is watching cable news all day. Right, and that they're getting far more polarized because they really trust, the one view they're getting. So I guess, is it important the journalists be trusted? I mean, we all know that if you do a list, whenever they do those surveys of like professions, how much you like your doctor or whoever, right? Journalists come second, last. Last is always the person who hands out parking tickets. But is it important? Is trust should trust be a value of journalism, or is truth something independent of that?
Well, I think journalists should aspire to be trusted. I think one of the things, if you've got a good journalist, whether it's at the local level or the national level, you can earn your audience's trust if you do good work. And if you do good work consistently, you can earn that trust. Should the audience just automatically, blindly trust journalists? Absolutely not. Journalists don't trust other journalists, and they shouldn't. The audience certainly shouldn't trust journalism. I think one of the challenges. So I was a practicing journalist for, I don't know, over 15 years, and had a wonderful, very lucky career, and saw my profession changing in a way that was very uncomfortable. And one of the reasons that I went to law school was to try to understand what the problems were and what happened, where things went wrong. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in teaching public policy is trying to understand the connections between public policy and the practice of journalism. And there is a very strong and important connection. You mentioned Walter Lippmann. One of the things that Walter Lippmann wrote about after the communications business had failed so miserably in so many different ways in the 50s, from the quiz show scandals to corruption at the FCC, any number of different ways, was that what was needed, in the United States at least, was a countervailing force against commercial broadcasting, against commercial media. You needed some force to be able to say, this is how you do it if you don't have to scrum for advertising. If your audience is no longer the advertisers, but if your audience really is the citizen, right, then maybe you will operate differently. And one of the things that I think Canada has benefited from for years, although it's not anywhere near where it was and not where I think it should be. It's not where the United Kingdom is. It's not where Norway is. It's not where it's not where Australia is support for the CBC. It is extraordinarily important, and that support and the operations of the CBC do have an impact on how the commercial folks operate. They set a sort of standard. They are able to, whether they're good or bad, right or wrong, as good as they could be, whatever it is, they suggest, well, this is one way to do it, right? We don't have that in the United States. It doesn't come close. The closest we come is NPR, and support for NPR is like maybe they get 7% of their funds from the government, but it's nothing. It's certainly not. It doesn't compare to CBC is, I think, 10 times as much. Norway is 100 times. It's incredible. Yeah. So it is extraordinarily important. But the point that I want to make, and sorry to go on about this, in many ways, many of the challenges that we're having in journalism are structural problems. They are public policy problems. They are not simply the ebb and flow of the practice of journalism on a regular basis. They are problems about what we decide in our society is the kind of journalism we want. And I think the most depressing thing about the survey is the notion that somehow Canadians really are not particularly strong supporters of the product of journalism that they want to get. And I don't know, I believe in democracy. I don't know how you get there without a democratic institution supporting journalism.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. We should just stop. Yeah.
Yeah.
As one of the low trust media.
I was going to say, if you weren't, I was going to.
No, I mean, Vice, as Andrew mentioned, is part of that startup ecosystem that's considerably less trusted, alongside BuzzFeed and Vox and a bunch of other outlets that are nonetheless doing good work. I mean, I look at trust as a double-edged sword for precisely the same reasons Emily Bell does, but also in the way that that I think a lot of academics have tended to measure trust, which it's kind of conflated with likability. or it's conflated with this idea of, you know, I wouldn't trust anyone in my newsroom to like babysit my kids. You know, I wouldn't trust, like I don't blame people for not trusting Vice in the sense that we seem to like drugs and sex too much to really be trusted with anything. But there's the standards, right? I mean, it doesn't change the fact that when we write a story, we get that story, you know, right, or we look to get that story right as no matter what the kind of consequences are as far as whether people are going to like us more, like us less, or I mean the point really is rather than trust or rather than building this kind of relationship where people look to you for moral or ethical guidance or even as a single source of information. I wouldn't want anyone looking to us as a single source of information. I think relevance is kind of a better thing to aim for. I'm not sure how we measure relevance, but trust seems like a kind of overrated thing or an overrated idea. In the sense that it doesn't really get you anywhere. I want people. I'm fine with people either disliking or disagreeing or deciding that they're, you know, that we don't take the right tack on a specific issue. I mean, we can back up what we're doing. So.
All right, good. Jennifer, you want the last word?
Yes. Well, I just wanted to pick up on the policy element of it, which is I think that the media in Canada doesn't do a very good job of telling people collectively, this is what you are about to lose. For example, I mean, I think one overarching, very important policy issue that's embedded in when we talk about Canadian journalism is social cohesion. And so if you live in Nanaimo, you should be able to read about what somebody in St. John's is doing and see yourself in that community and that person and a certain Canadianness, whatever that might be. But so my fear, and I see successive governments not paying too much attention to it, is we have the CBC, which is great. They have people in the north. They broadcast in both languages. You get a view of Canada when you listen to CBC radio or watch TV. So what are the other organizations in Canada that do that? Well, you have the Canadian Press, which is a pretty important institution, 100 years old. It's in bad shape. I don't think people know that too much. And you think about who else is left, CTV, Global, I mean, all of those organizations, the Post Media Network is like on its, you know, deathbed. So what happens when you don't have strong national organizations that tell you about each other and tell each other's stories and have standards? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a critical policy issue that we can't seem to shake politicians up to realize that this is something that they should pay attention to. And another thing about the CBC, and we're starting to realize this more, is that there's always a conflict in journalism between the commercial interests and good journalism, right? So you want to publish stuff that's clickbait, so that might mean publishing real crap about what's on Twitter, what Trump said, rather than the stuff that you should be investing in. And this is, an argument for some kind of government involvement or philanthropic involvement, which is another area that we don't talk about very much, to support journalism that does not hinge completely on advertising or on commercial interests. Robert Entman wrote an excellent book called Democracy Without Citizens, that's the name, which in essence he says, and this book was written 20, 30 years ago, journalism has this impossible problem. You have to have this commercial side, but you want to do good journalism. And so he says right in the book, you need a good public broadcaster, which we happen to have in Canada, and we should support more.
All right. I think we started a whole other conversation that should be a whole other panel, I think, at some point. So I think we'll stop there. Let's open up. We got about 10, 15 minutes left. There's one microphone right at the back in the middle. If you'd like to line up and ask a question, please identify yourself and direct a question to one of the three panelists, please. And try and avoid all prefatory remarks. Let's just get to it so we can get as many questions in as possible, please. So.
Could we have parity between men and women, please.
Parity between men and women in newsrooms?
Here.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Here at the mic. Very good. Okay. Yeah, I would support that too. Sir, go ahead.
Jennifer, you had mentioned that the president kind of throws journalists off with his Twitter because there's basically a lot of noise relative to signal. And that strikes me as interesting because what he's basically doing is driving the conversation by creating his own content.
Yeah,
and when
that's true.
people in politics realize that, I think they'll be pouring more and more resources into that. And I wouldn't be surprised if the next president had his own show on Netflix, you know what I mean? And so my question would be, how should journalists prepare to deal with that kind of future?
Well, I think we're already there. I mean, so our last prime minister had his own show called 24/7 and put it on YouTube. It was terrible. If you want to just watch, PR about your prime minister, our current prime minister is like an Instagram star. So you're right. You have a great point, which is they're their own broadcasters. They're their own, they have their own newsrooms. And so it's very hard to compete with that, especially in Canada where we're in such dire shape journalism-wise. And I don't know the answer to it except that you just kind of have to keep going, right? And keep doing as good as journalism as you possibly can when you're faced with this. I'll just add one small thing there, which is I think we can also get, and I admit to this as well, is getting caught up in process stories about all of their PR and their news management techniques. We can spend a lot of time as journalists dissecting that, like Doug Ford has a new channel as well. And that's another time waster, right? And there's a lot of criticism in the United States around this too, like how much process, we talk about when around elections when we could be working on other things. Yeah.
I'd like to get the next question, but I want to add one thing to that, just because I was at a public policy forum event a while ago under Chatham House rules, so I won't identify the person who said this, but it was on a similar topic, and a very senior NDP party strategist stood up and he said, look, for years, decades, we had to go and plead with journalists to cover us, beg for interviews, and you would give us 3 inches at the bottom of a story, one quote. And he said, we don't have to do that anymore. I can communicate directly with my base through social media, what have you, and I'm not going back, right? So however much you journalists want to rebuild the gatekeeper function you had, we're not interested in that. And I thought that was a pretty interesting take. Ma'am, you have a question?
Yes, my name is Nadia Alexan. The most important fact that maybe some of you did mention today is ownership. Who owns the newspaper? It would not be in the interest of, let's say, Fox News to have a report on public interest. So who's reporting on the public interest? And people know very little. For example, if you talk to people and tell them what are the origins of the Bank of Canada, how was the Bank of Canada created and why, and what is the difference between the Bank of Canada and the Bank of Infrastructure, which Trudeau has just imposed on us, they wouldn't know. So there's something wrong with the way a journalist report, and Jennifer was right about that. And there's no such thing as objectivity. Every journalist has his or her biases. There's no such thing as objectivity, but public interest and corporate ownership. Look at the difference, for example, between the Gazette and Le Devoir, which is an independent newspaper. Look at the difference. Le Devoir covers public interest stories.
So the question is...
My question is, corporate media, who owns the Fox News? It's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of hoodwinking the public and kowtowing to corporate interests rather than to citizenship.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Who owns Vice? Come on,
who owns
tell
Vice?
us. Who owns Vice?
Shane Smith owns Vice.
Disney owns Vice.
Yeah, Disney, ESPN. I don't know who the investors are, but in fact, that actually, in a way, that answers the question to the extent that, I mean, I've been working in this business for about 15 years now. I don't have a story to tell you about somebody else's politics being imposed on me, or their or having a specific ideological bent be imposed on any stories that I've written from ownership or even any of my bosses. So, I mean, I'm a little reluctant to agree that this is that either the corporate structure or even the commercial interests are all that much of a factor in either the ethical struggles that we're having or the financial struggles that we're having, or even the relevant struggles that we're having in media right now.
Mark, did Ted Turner ever tell you what to
No,
say?
no. And again, it's very, very early days at CNN. I mean, as ownership is extremely important, and people who are watching should know who are the powers behind the program or the news report or the whatever it is. It's important to know. As important as that is, it's also important to put in rules that suggest how these owners should behave. So without restricting their speech, without limiting them, whoever it is, from owning whatever they want to own, you should make sure that there are alternatives available and that they behave in a way that's responsible to the community. Yeah.
I think I'd like to get as many questions in as we can, so let's move on. Sir?
McGill Mijouet, McGill Faculty of Law. There's a difference between ordinary polarization and hyper-polarization. I'm not persuaded that in Canada we have hyper-polarization like in the US. Generally, hyperpolarization is measured by a number of different frameworks, like institutions, such as in the US, all the clashes about passing a budget and the shutdown of the federal government or blocking Obama's nominee for the Supreme Court. Another way to assess it is the range of issues in which people are divided. In the US, it's enormous in terms of divisions on very elementary questions like universal health care, the right to bear arms, abortion, whether climate change is a hoax, et what's the best evidence you have that in Canada we have hyper-polarization?
Oh, I think the evidence from the surveys we don't. Right. That's basically the happy result of the result is that we don't have that to that extent at all. That's the problem. Yeah, that's right. we're trying to, yeah. The survey took a while to do, but thank you. Yes?
Hi, my name is Shirley, and I'm from the McGill International Review, a student-run publication with McGill. I just have a quick question. Could you perhaps shed some light on New York Times' recent decision to publish their results from the Rod Rosenstein investigation, which I know is mostly viewed as having perhaps a detrimental effect on the Mueller investigation, which is so significant? And so if you as a journalist have some kind of license to give no oxygen to someone like Faith Goldy in Toronto, is there a flip side to that? Maybe is there the question of publishing, like the decision to publish something, which may perhaps lead to something with with larger consequences like obstruction of justice?
Which is the investigation? I didn't catch
the Rod Rosenstein investigation in the U.S. Sorry, it's more of a U.S. context. The Deputy Attorney General of the U.S.
Oh, Rod Rosenstein.
Yeah.
Oh, the Rosenstein thing. Oh, okay. Is there anyone on the panel you'd like to address that to?
Anyone who wants to take it. Doesn't really matter.
Well, I have to admit I'm not 100% sure of the story that you're referring to, but I don't think you could conceal. I probably wouldn't err on the side of concealing something because you worried about it affecting, an investigation, or I mean, I think that really puts you into a kind of partisan or activist territory. Imagine if anyone found out that you sat on something like that. I mean, you would destroy your reputation forever. But I'm not clear on all the details of this one, so.
We had a similar case when I worked at L'Actualité where somebody had phoned up one of our political writers and offered to send him the UPAC, the anti-corruption unit's file, investigative file, into Nathalie Normando, the former vice premier in Quebec, and also all the files that involved the investigations of like a bunch of other senior provincial liberals in Quebec. And this was, I mean, more beyond sort of highly sensitive information at the time, because her trial was just getting started. None of this information was public. And we never got our hands on the actual documents. It's a long story, but we ended up actually writing a story. We ended up writing a story about how much UPAC was leaking like a sieve, and how much, like, what was happening. There were people inside that organization who were actively looking to disrupt the prosecution of former members of the Liberal government. So I think there are ways. I mean, if you sort of, you have to sit down and think about it when you get that kind of stuff, right? And I think there are ways of covering those stories, of getting that information, not necessarily hiding it in a drawer, but figuring out what the actual public interest in that story is. In this case, clearly somebody is trying to torpedo. And it's not clear which side, but you try and figure that out.
That's good. Okay.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hi, my name is Gabriel. I'm a student in the Faculty of Law. My question speaks to one of the comments that was made by Mark to kind of formalize or make it more rigorous and check our facts. And this is obviously a very lengthy process, and it means that it will take longer before the piece is out. In the Faculty of Law, a tool that is very, very popular is PubDocs. It is a bunch of summaries all put together because it is convenient for a lot of people to read a few paragraphs about a case rather than read 100 pages on that case. I read a book recently by Ryan Holiday, Trust Me, I'm Lying, and he describes a very terrifying kind of race to the bottom. Is, have about a sentence or two to catch the attention of your reader. So my question to all three panelists has to do with not so much what you cover, but how you cover it and how much you take into consideration the way the end user of your product is consuming it.
Maybe I would ask you just to make it a little bit more precise, more detailed, your question.
So not a lot of people like to read a lot.
Right.
It's if I can read what the president thinks in 140 characters, apparently a lot of people do that. So when it comes to checking your facts and elaborating on how you acquired them, because I assume there's part of the methodology will go into piece. This is how we got to this story, and so as to convey to the reader that this is legit. It will be longer. So how much of how the consumer consumes your piece how much do you think about how I will read your article before you write it?
Okay.
I like it short, and I think a lot of people like it short too.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not all three of you need to answer. Maybe two of you can pick this up so we can just keep the questions moving.
I would say that in journalism, everything is packaged. Like you package something into a tweet, and you package it into like a brief, and then you have the long version. So, for example, I worked a long time at the Canadian Press, and we would have an alert, which was like a sentence. This plane crashed, and then we would like write 4 paragraphs. And in each iteration, you're trying to put, it's like the old inverted pyramid, right? You're trying to put shove as much information at the top, because either it's all you know, or that's all the person's going to read. But I mean, ultimately, the rigor has to be there in the overall story. And you hope that the person is going to go back and read the long version and not just the one on the iPhone, with the paragraph, because that doesn't tell you very much. What I think is a problem is, journalists go to a government announcement, and you see some people slagging them on Twitter or online, and they're like, the Prime Minister says the budget will be like, balanced by 2014, and you're like, yeah, well, I could have watched his Instagram feed, and I could have read the same thing. Like, maybe just wait 5 minutes until you can write something that has more context.
Yeah. It's worth pointing out, that this is not a new problem, and that news stories,
have what's called a lead, right? Which is like the first line, which is essentially a tweet telling you what the story's about, right? And it's followed by something newswriters call a nut graph, which gives you all the context you need for why this is important, right? So it's something that's been built into the structure of news stories that readership declines, geometrically with every paragraph.
Yeah, even online, we have these tools, right? Like where we measure how deep into the page somebody reads. And
Do you use those?
Yeah, all the time.
Oh, really? Eh?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just interesting from a sort of academic perspective. It's interesting too because you can tell if somebody's dropping off at a particularly complex paragraph or at a graph or at an image or at a photo. So it does change the layout. But it's a real question as if you look at, for example, I mean, probably the most important story of the last 4 or 5 weeks in U.S. politics was that gargantuan story that the Times ran about Trump's taxes, right? I mean, there was the word outright fraud in the lead, right? So sitting president is accused of outright fraud by the probably arguably the single most important newspaper in the United States, and that story got nowhere. Like nothing. It didn't even warrant a press conference out of the White House. So it is actually a serious, I wouldn't say problem, but it's a serious concern in like how you package your story to get it read. Yeah, we do it by platform. We know if somebody's only going to read 2 things, we put it on Snapchat and whatever.
I think entire courses will be taught about that New York Times story and why it failed to get traction, I think. Okay. So, yeah. One more question, and then I think we're going to have to, you'll have to, if you're standing in line, not to pigeonhole the panelists over wine immediately afterwards. So last question, Ali?
Hi guys, my name's Ali. You all spoke really, supportively of the CBC, while at the same time talking about the real possibility that the major media companies in the country and the major news companies could very well go bankrupt. And the question I have for you guys is that, is it possible the CBC's massive $1 billion subsidy is making it very hard for those companies to compete, while at the same time the CBC is not necessarily doing the best job as a public broadcaster? I'll give you an example. During the Toronto race, I believe they didn't even show the election night. They just showed Murdoch Mysteries. And the top 20 TV shows in the country, if you look at the list, not a single show is a CBC show. So it's pretty much 100% other people putting the entertainment out there. So that's my question. Is the CBC really the helpful thing here, or is it hurting the major companies?
Well, I'm a fan of the notion of public broadcasting. CBC barely actually qualifies for that. The fact that CBC is actually able to take advertising and that it does use advertising to some extent sort of throws them out of the group of organizations like the Australian Broadcasting Company and the British Broadcasting Company and others. The CBC is just a little better than the United States. Again, when you compare it to other countries that do public broadcasting. Its funding has been cut dramatically, brought up a little bit by Trudeau, but nowhere near what this vast country needs. Service for both minority communities, for indigenous communities, is next to nothing. The local community broadcasters get almost nothing to do the work that they need to do. The CBC is not supported to the extent to which it should be. Again, and part of that has to do with the fact that the funding comes from Parliament. So these are policy issues. These are policy issues. Now, and I also must admit, if there were a robust CBC doing really good news and creating an audience for that, maybe the other media would probably be doing a little bit better because there was a thirst for that and there was a thirst for some alternative point of view. But the challenge is going to be, again, I think the core problem is the fact that the money comes from Parliament, that it doesn't come from some satellite tax or tax on some others, or tax on the other broadcasters or other media. But again, figuring out a way to solve that problem has to rise to the level of a discussion about who you're voting for, to be your representative in Parliament. But it's not there yet. I mean, it's not there.
I think we'll stop there. Please join me in thanking the panel. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Andrew, Phil, Jennifer, and Mark. Thank you very much. How many people sitting here right now would come to an event in this room if the panel discussion were, does the CBC deserve more of your taxpayers' dollars? How many people? Arms up, arms up. All right. I'd like to have that event. We're going to look forward to that. Thank you all very much. I love seeing a full room, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions, but as Andrew said, as you head out and you can stop and get a glass of wine and some snacks, you can buttonhole some of these speakers. And the final thing I will say is to thank the speakers with, Max Bell is a new School of Public Policy, and we haven't yet developed our own swag. So we're using McGill swag to thank the speakers. But in the future, next time you come back, we'll have Max Bell swag. Thank you all very much, and see you in the next room.